So, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rob Atkinson, president of ITIF, and I want to welcome you to this event. You guys want to come on up and sit for a minute? This event to release a new report by us on competitiveness policy, in particular, what countries, including the United States, should be doing to think about advancing economic global competitiveness. We have a great panel today. We're going to be also joined by Senator Chris Coons, more towards the tail end of the event, so I'm going to hold off on introducing Senator Coons for now, but I will introduce our sterling panel. To my immediate left is Mark Muro. Mark is Director of Policy at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings Institution. He has really led an amazing amount of really fascinating projects, most recently on digital jobs around the country. He's done great work on assessing the state of advanced manufacturing, advanced technology manufacturing industries, and others. Prior to joining Brookings, he had been at another institute in Arizona, part of Arizona State University, and comes out of the third estate, having been a writer for the Boston Globe and an editor for the Arizona Daily Star. My colleague Sri Ramaswamy is a partner at McKinsey Global Institute, which I think in the Global Think Tank Index from Penn is ranked the #1 private think tank in the world, as I recall. So
I'm not sure what that means, but yeah.
It is a great ranking because we're #2 in the world under science and tech think tank, so it's premier. But well deserved. If you haven't followed MGI's work, and particularly Shree's work in this space, you're missing something. He leads the research on economics of digitization and the economics of multinational corporations. And under Shree's team, they just released a report, I guess 2 weeks ago, on advanced manufacturing competitiveness, where the U.S. stacks up, and Shree will talk a little bit about that. And then last but not least is my longtime colleague, Andrew Reamer. Andrew is with the George Washington Institute of Public Policy. He's been there since 2010. Prior to that, he worked at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. And for the prior 20 years before that, he was really one of the leading consultants in the country on regional economic development. Had his PhD from MIT. So, with that, let's jump right in. Okay, so I want to release this report today. This, if you followed, we released a report earlier this year on productivity. We're going to release another big one next year on innovation. Those to us are sort of the three big things that we need to be thinking about as policymakers: productivity, competitiveness, and innovation. And they're different, which I will talk about in just a moment. So I want to really focus on 5 things. What is competitiveness? How competitive is the U.S. economy today? Why is it important to be competitive? Why don't we have a competitiveness policy? We have competitiveness policies that affect competitiveness, but we really do not have a competitiveness policy. And then lastly, what are some thoughts on what that policy might look like? Okay, so what is competitiveness? The dominant definition that most everybody uses today is productivity. This is wrong. That's not the definition of competitiveness, but people like Krugman, the World Economic Forum, the Council on Competitiveness, everybody has latched on to this definition that productivity equates to competitiveness. The reason it's wrong is simply because you could have an incredibly productive economy where all your productivity is in non-traded sectors that don't compete in international marketplaces. Imagine having a great healthcare, productive healthcare sector, retail, restaurants, wholesale trade, and the like. You'd have a high productivity economy, but a low competitiveness economy. So competitiveness is not productivity. It's related, but it's not the same. And I think that's a major point of argumentation we should have, because if that's the definition of competitiveness, what Porter and World Economic Forum suggest, and it leads you off into a whole different direction of policy. I think what competitiveness is, and this was a definition that we developed in this, is It's the ability of a nation's not traded sectors outside of essentially oil and gas and minerals, which are sort of natural things to have. It's the non-mineral based traded sectors to effectively compete in global markets, quote, importantly, in the absence of government subsidies and protections while receiving a strong price premium that enables high dollar. Okay, I wish I could give you a set definition that's 3 words, but it's a complicated question, and so it's more than 3 words. What are we really saying there? Number one, it's about your traded sectors. It's not about electric utilities. It's not about retail, by and large. It's really about manufacturing, software. McKinsey consulting firm is a traded sector. They sell a lot of their services around the globe. So it's sectors that sell around the globe to compete effectively in the absence of government subsidies and protections. If you look at a country like China, it looks incredibly competitive because they're running a big trade surplus, lots of exports. But are they competitive? Who the heck knows? Because they massively subsidize their exporters and they massively hinder and limit their imports. So you can't really tell whether that's the case. If you look at the US, are we competitive? Well, we're running a pretty big trade deficit, but on the other hand, the dollar is higher than where it should be. So I think that's really the right way to think about it. The end game is you want to be able to run something close to balanced trade and do it in a way where your currency is pretty high. Why does that matter? Because when you have a high currency, it means that I export $100 worth of goods to somebody else, and I can get a lot more back in that trade if your currency is strong. So, how competitive is the U.S. economy? Again, when you look at the conventional reports, the story is basically, wow, we are great. There's nothing to worry about here. Move on. Because the IMD says we're #1 in the world, the most competitive economy in the world. World Economic Forum had us as #2. We've fallen dramatically down to #3 last year, or this year. And the Council on Competitiveness says we're the 2nd most competitive in the manufacturing sector, due to soon be the most competitive. Now, I would argue that these are all, just as they're wrong about productivity, they're wrong about this assessment. Why are they so Pollyannish, and why do I think they're wrong? These reports make 3 big mistakes. Number one, they include indicators that have virtually nothing to do with what you and I would call competitiveness. For example, the level of malaria in a country, the level of inflation in a country, the number of airline flights in a country. What do these have to do with competitiveness? Maybe at some point they're related inputs, if you really stretch it. But they're certainly not the most important indicators of competitiveness as inputs, and certainly not as competitiveness indicators of output. They rely on opinion. So a lot of these studies go out and they ask CEOs, hey, what do you think is the most competitive country in the world? The US, because it was last year. And so you have this sort of confirmation bias that keeps getting repeated. It also hurts smaller countries like, say, Sweden, which I think probably is one of the most competitive countries in the world. But who the heck pays any attention to Sweden? It's only got, 12 million people. And lastly, they ignore national, what I would call discounting and charging. So a country that looks on the face of it quite competitive. Let's take Singapore, for example, which, by the way, Singapore is doing a lot of really great things. I don't mean to be overly critical. Singapore is running an enormous trade surplus, enormous, and they're very successful in advanced industries. And yet, Singapore manipulates its currency for competitive advantage, according to the IMF. Now, if they're really competitive, you don't need to manipulate your currency. You don't need to keep it artificially low. If you think you're good enough to play in the game on your own, play in the game. So the fact that none of these studies really control for this factor, I think makes a lot, and they have these other, I think make basically every single study that ranks countries on competitiveness pretty much meaningless. It just doesn't give you any real insight into performance. I would argue, though, the U.S. economy has become less competitive. The trade-weighted value of the dollar is unchanged since '98, and yet the trade deficit is up 87%. If the trade deficit was up 87% and the value of the dollar was up, okay, then that maybe is we haven't changed position, but the value of the dollar stays the same, trade deficit goes up. That suggests a loss of competitiveness in the global market. Okay. Why do we care about this? Why don't we just care about fiscal policy? Why don't we care about what basically the majority of the lion's share of the economic media care about, which is interest rates and the job numbers? Because competitiveness is critical for a nation for 4 big reasons. One is just purely living standards. Traded sector jobs pay about 10% more than non-traded sector jobs. So when you lose traded sector jobs, you're shifting from, by definition, from good jobs to less good jobs. Secondly, related to that, when we lose traded sector jobs, that's essentially the equivalent of the Fed raising interest rates. In other words, it's the Fed uses the term lean into the wind. That is a stiff wind, a stiff headwind against the US economy. So in the 2000s, we were losing, we lost about 45,000 manufacturing plants in the US closed. That's equivalent to one every day or a few every day. And that means that every day we were getting essentially little mini recessions, little slowdowns. That, more than any other factor, was why the Fed kept interest rates so dramatically low in the 2000s. Because it was leaning against this wind. The wind was loss of competitiveness. The Fed responds with super low interest rates. We all know the result. The result was the worst financial collapse since the Great Depression, because the Fed had to lean in so hard because we were losing competitiveness. If we had not lost competitiveness, the Fed would have been able to raise interest rates, would have been able to stem the housing bubble, and we wouldn't be in the pickle we were in. The third is more favorable terms of trade. What do I mean by that? Right now, every few years, the average American incurs a trade debt. I just bought a Jeep Cherokee, so it's a great car. It's a wonderful car. We have this old car. Finally, to buy a new car, we bought a Jeep Cherokee. Turns out, every 4 years, the average American household is essentially getting a free Jeep Cherokee. That's the amount of trade debt we're incurring. In other words, that's the amount of stuff we're not paying for now. So if we had a much stronger currency, in other words, the dollar being worth a lot more than it's worth now, we could afford to buy more things overseas at a lower price. The last factor is what Keynes called animal spirits. In Keynes's view of the world, when he wrote the general theory of employment, interest, and money, he said, the most important thing, not interest rates, government spending, it's what people feel. So anybody who goes and makes an investment, whether that's a kid going to college or a company putting in a new assembly plant, that is essentially based on faith and hope and trust. You hope and have faith that the future is going to make it worthwhile for you to invest. And when there's a sort of competitiveness malaise, which I would say has plagued the US for the last 15 to 20 years, that dampens the animal spirits. It makes us all less willing to take risks and make investments. So, what do we need? I would argue we need a national competitiveness policy. And that is 2 factors that are important. Coordinated between agencies, between Congress and the administration, and strategic, not just a hodgepodge of policies that happen to find their way through the process of policymaking. And they need to be in 6 big areas: tax, regulation, skills, analysis, technology, and talent. So I'll go into more details there. But what I want to spend maybe most of the rest of my time on, trying to wrap up relatively quickly, is why don't we have a competitiveness policy? There's really only 2 reasons you can imagine for any policy thing. It's either interest or ideology. In other words, interests sort of don't want one, whether that's labor or business or whatever, or it's ideology. Hard to make the case that interests actively oppose a competitiveness policy. Lots and lots of companies, and certainly the AFL-CIO would love a competitiveness policy, lots of companies in the industry. I will argue that it's really ideology. And there's two main components of that ideology that really dominate Washington and on a pretty much daily basis send out a message to policymakers. Do not put in place a competitiveness policy. If you do so, you will do it at your peril. So what do I mean by that? The first are from economists. Economists, and by economists I mean most economists, not Andrew Reamer or Mark Muro, but most economists, Krugman, Mankiw, most think tanks over on Mass Avenue, except for Mark's Haven, believe all of this. Number one, they actually believe that competitiveness doesn't exist. It's a made-up sort of fake news term. Paul Krugman says the notion that nations compete is incorrect. So we simply do not compete. Now, no other country in the world believes this. No other country. They understand that they're competing with other countries. We're the only one who has that view. One of the senior economists at the Congressional Research Service, so if you're a member or staffer here and you ask for CRS's opinion on this, they will tell you, quote, they will tell you that competitiveness is, quote, a term without rigorous meaning. So, number one, they just deny that there's a thing called competitiveness. Boeing competes with Airbus, we don't compete with Europe. Secondly, they will argue that it doesn't really matter what our industrial structure is. If we lose advanced manufacturing and we specialize instead in exporting waste paper, that's fine, because that's our true comparative advantage. One leading think tank, president of a leading think tank, former president of a leading think tank near Mark, neighbor of Mark's, was asked by a reporter, how much do you think the U.S. could lose of its manufacturing base and still be economically healthy? And his answer was, all of it. Now, he's not an anomaly. That is the wisdom of the crowd here, in this case, the wisdom of the elite crowd. We don't need to worry about our industrial structure. The fact that a famous quote by potato chips, computer chips, by Michael Boskin when he was in the Bush CA. Computer chips, potato, what's the difference? It's all, a dollar of one is worth a dollar of the other. My favorite quote here, and this is, as I said, a completely bipartisan consensus among the economics priesthood, is Alan Blinder's quote. Famous economist, was in the CEA under Clinton, is Princeton. Alan Blinder was writing about the decimation of the U.S. television industry, in part due to bad antitrust policy in the U.S. Alan Blinder said, the number of television sets manufactured in the USA, in the United States, is 0. A failure? No, a success. So the logic of this is anything bad that happens, by definition, is a success, because it reveals our competitive advantage, our comparative advantage. We were not meant to make televisions. So in that logic, the Saudis should dominate semiconductors because they have the most sand in the world. Semiconductors are made with silicon, if you don't know that. The third component is, even if we were to recognize that competitors is real, even if we were to recognize that the industries Mark has documented, these advanced industries are actually pretty important, it really doesn't matter, because anything we would do would be harmful, would be suboptimal. It's rejected because it violates the wisdom of the market. If the market says we're supposed to be exporting waste paper, we're supposed to be exporting waste paper. Now, we leave aside all of the arguments and good economic evidence from other innovation economists who point out the fallacy of that. The fourth is we're doing fine. Any evidence to the contrary can be rationalized away. My favorite there is when I encourage you, when you listen to how economists talk about what happened to the U.S. manufacturing sector in the last 15 years, there's a rule that they have that if they ever say it's due to trade, they will be excommunicated from the economics priesthood. Repeat after me. We lost a third of our manufacturing jobs because of automation. Well, That would make sense if it were only true, because the automation rates in 2000 and the automation rates in the 90s were the same. In fact, productivity in the 90s was higher for manufacturing, and we lost 2% of our jobs in manufacturing in the 90s and 33% in the 2000s. They intentionally go out of their way to obfuscate the evidence, which we've done, Sue Hausman, EPI, and others, that show that trade is responsible for approximately half of the job loss in U.S. manufacturing. To the extent they will even allow you to point to the trade deficit, which, by the way, a core component of their views are the trade deficit is a meaningless number that has no relationship to competitiveness. What the trade deficit is, it's an indicator of your savings rate. So we don't save enough. That's why we have the trade deficit. I won't go into details why that's wrong. It basically confuses a core thing you learned in economics or statistics of the difference between correlation and causation. Fifth is there's no way that globalization could have hurt U.S. competitiveness, because trade is always win-win. Any protectionist policies are basically, according to one report, stemming from anxiety. So they're just sort of these, I like you, if you have a friend who's sort of overly anxious, and just calm down, it's okay, pat him on the head, you really don't know what you're doing. That at some level is true, that trade is win-win, but it's only true, and William Baumol did classic work on this before he unfortunately died, it's only true under a certain limited set of circumstances, where you don't have industries where there are learning economies of scale and learning effects, and more importantly, where you don't have countries that are systematically violating global trade norms and rules, like China. In those situations, trade can be win-lose, which is what we've seen. And lastly, they will argue, well, okay, even though China's doing something, we can't do anything because we can't be mercantilists. Mercantilism is always bad. So confronting mercantilism with something more than a don't do this, China, which is what we've been doing something more than that is seen as inviolate, is seen as sort of a violation of the norms and is termed mercantilist. So just don't do anything. So if that weren't bad enough, you have, I think, what's even more powerful in Washington, and that's the national security establishment. Particularly when it comes to trade policy, the national security establishment more or less calls the shots. And in that framework, they will argue that U.S. national security goals always trump economic goals. So that means, and you've seen this in the history of the United States foreign policy, we always give on critical trade questions in service of national security. You're seeing that now to some extent with North Korea, where we're not as tough with China because we feel like we need China to help us with the North Korean nuclear issue. But we've done that consistently and we continue to do it. The problem with that, and I'm not saying that national security goals are not important, what I'm saying is two things. One, they always trump economic goals. And number two, there is no process in the federal government right now where the equities for competitiveness get a fair hearing in that process. So at the National Security Council and other venues, it's the national security issues and questions that get first order interest. One of the problems with that, though, is national security is not just about our interests, it's a global interest. So we are essentially playing a role nationally where we are producing a global good. In other words, a secure global system, hopefully with democracy and security. Other countries realize that, and they play off that, our willingness to sacrifice our own well-being for the global good, and they systematically play off that. And they don't advance global national security interests to any extent as we do, and instead focus on their economic interests. A little bit like a prisoner's dilemma game, where the prisoner knows that the United States prisoner will always confess every single time, and therefore they deny. If you know prisoner's dilemma, if you confess, you get 10 years in jail. If the other guy denies, and the guy who denies gets 0. So we really have to think about how the national security establishment takes this seriously. I think that's beginning to change, and I hope it starts changing even faster, because more and more people in the national security establishment are understanding that one of our biggest threats going forward is going to be a militarized China with technology capabilities as equal to, if not superior to ours. That's the path we're going down. And the fact that we've ignored our economic competitiveness is a way for that path to come to realization and fruition much sooner. So I'm hopeful that that will begin to change, and you're going to see more and more people in the DoD establishment in particular begin to say we need a national competitiveness strategy and we need to fight Chinese innovation mercantilism more seriously. Okay, so let me just close by saying, what do we need to do? It was reported in one level as not intended to be a specific agenda. We had an earlier report which was called 50 Ways to Leave Your Competitiveness Woes Behind, which was my colleague Stephen Ezell took the lead on. Very detailed set of policy steps. This was more general. But first of all, one of the main things we need to do is we need to stop, if we could, this sort of partisan manichaeism we have here. The Republicans say, well, we can do these two things. We can get a better and more streamlined regulatory system and a better tax system, and Democrats then reject that. And the Democrats support more things like public infrastructure investment, science funding, skill development, etc., and the Republicans reject that. That's where we are. Now, I don't know another country in the world that has that divide. Every other country that we look at around the world with robust competitiveness policies, they're doing all of this. They're not just picking one side or the other depending on the party in power. So, regulatory, we go into detail there. One of the things we really do need to do within OIRA, in OMB, they have a cost-benefit analysis process, but they don't have a process whereby you would look systematically at how regulations impact traded sectors in particular. That's something we could do. Tax policy, can't say anything about tax policy because Congress is in the middle of doing all that, but I would say that there's some very useful things in the tax bill. I think expensing, I would have liked an investment tax credit, but moving to first-year expensing is in the same vein, in the same direction as investment tax credit. They retained the R&D credit, although if you've been following the stories about the AMT, it could hurt the R&D credit, which I think would be a major catastrophe. So hopefully that'll get fixed in conference. So I think the idea of using, and frankly having a lower rate does make us more competitive. So I think those are all important steps. But if that's all we do, it's not enough. The idea of just saying, well, we're going to have a nice environment out there and we hope our firms can take advantage of it, I just don't believe that's enough anymore. Those are table stakes. Other countries are actively working, to be clear, not to protect their firms and not to subsidize their firms, but to help their firms become better competitors. And they're doing that through things like industrial-focused R&D policies. The Koreans spend 89 times more than we do on those kinds of policies than as a share of GDP on industrial-oriented research. The Germans 43 times. Why are the Germans running a trade surplus with China when their manufacturing wages are 43% higher than ours? Because they have systematically helped their firms move up the value chain and get into segments that are hard for the Chinese to compete against. We've made some important steps there. Manufacturing USA program. We need to do more, obviously, in terms of the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program. There's a Manufacturing USA bill that Senator Coons championed. So there are things we're doing, but we just need to keep doing more of them and doing them better. Skill development, key component. We're pretty haphazard there, especially when you compare us to the global leaders, countries like Austria and Germany. Ex-Im Bank, what can you say? This is a government agency that has never lost money and is designed to help our exporters compete against countries that are putting between 4 to 10 times more export financing credits behind their deals than we are. We have to maintain, if not expand them. Trade policies. We created Select USA, 6 years ago, nice program, little program. You compare that to what Singapore, Ireland, France are doing, where they scour the world for the best investment, work to get them to come to their own country. We don't do that, really. And then finally, enforcing trade and fighting mercantilism. I think this is, to me, a very positive impact of the Trump trade agenda. Trump, you can argue over certain things, are they pursuing NAFTA the right way or not, which I won't go into. But I think overall, they're saying that they want to get tough, particularly with China, is an important step. I don't see how we will win the competitiveness race unless we do that with China. And I don't mean to say we should hold China back, I just think we should hold them to the commitments they made when they voluntarily joined the World Trade Organization in 2000. And last analysis, I got a lot of my insights from my colleague Andrew Reamer, who really has done the best work in this space. What has the U.S. government been able to do over the years? And frankly, the capabilities of the U.S. government to understand our industrial structure and competitiveness were better in 1917 than they are today. They're better in 1917. They've been hollowed out. They don't know very much. I don't mean that individuals don't know much, but the ability for the government to really analyze this. So I think we need to be able to assess traded sectors. We need to focus on traded sectors and develop roadmaps, which, by the way, most of our competitors are doing. The Canadians now are doing this. The UK is doing this. The French are doing this. And then lastly, related to all this, we need a whole of government approach to this. We need to have some kind of institutional coordination mechanism within the government that has competitiveness as its main focus and brings together the disparate parts of the administration and the agencies to at least think about that. With that, I will stop and thank you for your attention, and I think we can just go in order. And Mark, you're welcome to come up or stay there if anyone.
Thank you.
Also, there's some seats up here, 2 seats here, seat there. If you're in the back, feel free to come on up.
Great. Well, that was excellent. I feel like we've just been presented the kind of code of Hammurabi or the Rosetta Stone. Seriously, and I do think no one has spent more time than Rob codifying the basics over and over and over. And there's obviously still a huge amount of work to be done here. So I think we've heard what competitive strategy is, why a hardcore strategy is not now imperative, not just needed, and what some of the components would be. I want to just talk about, touch base on the 4 aspects that I think are particularly important, from some of which Rob talked about here, others are in the report. And I'm delighted because, I think Rob has, for all intents and purposes, said case closed on multiple debates that for some reason are still open and should have been. We would have been better off if we had reached resolution on some of them, decades ago. But few things I think are important. First, Rob makes clear that not all economic activity is equally important. We seem to be backsliding on that in the country, as I think the economic conditions in much of the country have deteriorated. I think re-emphasizing the importance of the traded sector, and then within that, the importance of its composition. We've worked with Sri's group at McKinsey to identify 50 advanced high R&D, high STEM worker industries. And then we've tried to look at the structure regional economies have in their presence of those industries. So first trying to identify that important subsector of the traded sector, and then going further to look at individual competitive strategies for individual industries and where they sit. You can have a presence in an industry but not be that competitive in it. So I think that's an obvious but very important aspect. I always find very timely the report's focus on innovation. You didn't talk about that as much this morning or this afternoon, but the argument is driven home here that innovation is relatively more important in a globally integrated economy. I find that an important framing. I think we've been mounting arguments for an innovation-based economy and a aggressive innovation strategy for decades as well, but I think Rob has put his finger on a reason why that is relatively more important, as really most places share some of the basic factors of competitiveness. So it's how countries put those together that matters most. I'll just say ditto to going far beyond providing basic framework conditions. Here too, many nations now have the framework in place. So again, differentiation of American presence requires going deeper and with deeper strategy. And then this is an obvious thing, but I applaud the focus on intentions. Andy knows, as an alumnus of the Metro program, Brookings, that intentionality was an obsessive word in-house, sometimes meaningless to us, excessively used, but I think it runs through. It's just a basic starting point. You have to have an intention with what one is doing on these strategy questions. And so I think Rob's insistence is welcome when he says that a big portion of intentionality is about spurring economic actors, whether firms or industries or cities, something I want to talk about in just a minute, to take actions and become more productive and innovative and competitive is where intentionality plays out, or at least in one way. We shouldn't be afraid of that. Clearly, the U.S. hasn't been intentional enough, whether in managing trade or in ensuring the availability in the U.S. of high-quality factor inputs. All of the things that Rob just mentioned are, dimensions that have been not intentionally provided enough. So again, it's a great kind of 10 Commandments, important kick in the rear from ITIF. I want one quibble or a friendly amendment. I do want to suggest that more needs to be said about the importance of regions and the need for attention to them in any improved strategy. I take the point that Rob makes that bottom-up initiatives by themselves will almost certainly not be sufficient given the massive state-driven investments being made around the world. Nevertheless, I would just note that in a large, variegated, open nation like ours, the regional component is a crucial feature of any smart competitive strategy. You allude to this and have some paragraphs, but I do think diverse regional clusters or ecosystems or whatever you want to call them are central building blocks of high-value traded sector economies. This reflects deep, dynamics of regional economics, the agglomeration economies that maybe have become relatively more important in the network information-based economy. So that it's an admission, I think, to not to call explicitly for a regional dimension or component of a sophisticated competitiveness strategy. And then finally considering how to deepen those clusters and push back against their thinning, which I think, such as we can locate data of the sort that Andy is always trying to add to. We're seeing some very disturbing, I think, trends, sort of hollowing out of regional clusters and regional supply chains, which I would say is a matter of national economic strategy, but it's also increasingly a matter of social and political concern now. So sitting idly by while the nation's intermetro balances grow wider and wider is not just a social problem or an economic problem, but a social problem. So again, I think some of this is latent in the report, but I just want to put a tag on that.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Sri, do you want to do it from there? And I'll hand you the... You want to do it from up here?
Yes.
Clicker set. I think if you just click...
I do work for a consulting firm, so I can't do anything without slides.
So thank you, Rob. Thank you for the invitation and also for the report. I would highly encourage folks in this room to read this report if you've not already done so. Both this and Stephen's earlier work on gets into a lot more detail about competitiveness. I wanted to bring this home a little bit because for me, some of these aspects really did strike home just because we had just concluded research on the US manufacturing sector 2 weeks ago. And we found many of these sorts of themes emerging both from the analytical work and from the interviews that we did with both large and small companies in the US, large and small manufacturing firms. And so, when you think about competitiveness in a global context, you really have to think about the manufacturing sector because the manufacturing sector, in some sense, embodies many of those traits that make a nation competitive. Rob alluded to some of these things. Some of these traits have been mistaken for competitiveness themselves. They are not quite the same thing, but they are linked. And so you see that manufacturing in the US, for instance, it's about 10% or so of the economy, but it's driven a third of all of our productivity growth in the last 20 years. It drives 60% of our exports, 70% of our R&D. And so those sorts of metrics, those are linked to how you think about a nation's competitiveness, and you see that manufacturing is sort of front and center there. And so what happens to manufacturing really is sort of an indicator of how competitive a nation really is. And so one of the things that we did in the research was to start talking to companies and sort of do this meta-analysis of competitiveness to say, what is competitiveness from a manufacturing standpoint? And the way that we thought about it was, what does it take for a company to come to the US to invest here, to expand their operations here, right? What are the kinds of things that they look at? And of course, the answer changes depending on whether you're talking to a chemical company or an aerospace company or a food manufacturing company, right? But by and large, we sort of saw a few of these themes emerging. And some of these themes, if you look at the boxes on the left, in terms of the market access or the infrastructure or the institutions, these are things that are similar to the work that Rob has done and Steve has done as well. But there were a couple of things that stood out here as areas of concern for us that we had not expected to see. So for instance, at the very bottom, this notion of workforce development, not from the perspective of do we have the world's best scientists and engineers. It's not so much about that. It's much more the collaboration between workers and labor institutions and employers, and how does the US stack up in a global economy in that sort of environment? And that starts to matter when you think about the role that technology could play in the future in terms of changing skill demand in a rapid form, right? And so the more collaboration you have, the more likely you are as a nation to be able to respond in kind to the needs of employers. And there we see that the US is not doing all that well. Another one that really came out, if you look at the very top, is the idea of suppliers. Now, this is something that was particularly concerning to us because this gets back to the industrial base, the point that Mark made, that the industrial base has been getting hollowed out. It's been getting hollowed out for about 20, 25 years. And you sort of see the decline of the manufacturing sector really evident in the hollowing out of that base. Now, the issue that we're seeing here is that this is now a cycle that's feeding on itself. Because now we have companies, large firms coming to us saying, you know what, we want to expand operations in the US, we just can't find suppliers anymore. And so you're going to import components and parts and capabilities. And so you've got this cycle going now where for a variety of reasons, the industrial base started to weaken starting in the late 90s or so. And especially over the last 5-6 years, you've seen that even with the manufacturing resurgence, the so-called reshoring wave, which really wasn't reshoring at all, you've seen a significant issue with the capability of the domestic supply base. So that's something that was particularly concerning to us. We started looking into that a little bit more, and what you found was, if you look over the last 25 years at the US manufacturing sector and this decline in competitiveness, this has played out differently for different companies in the manufacturing sector. And so if you were a large firm, you see the line in the red, in the black, if you were a large manufacturing firm based in the US, yes, the US as a whole was losing competitiveness, but large firms generally did better at being able to navigate that decline in competitiveness, right? And so they saw significantly stronger revenue growth rates. But if you were a small or mid-sized firm, you were in that group of lines that were all declining. So you all see negative revenue growth rates for 25 years. So it's worth thinking about what that means from the perspective of national competitiveness when for 25 years, your industrial base is seeing negative revenue growth, right? You end up with firms that are locked in a cycle of basically surviving, which means they're not going to make investments, they're not going to see productivity improvements, they cannot attract talent, right? They're not going to be digital ready. And so that's the vicious cycle that we've got going in this economy right now. Right, we saw the same trend, by the way, if you look at other financial indicators, if you look at the profit margins or the return on invested capital, you see the same kinds of trends where there's a significant difference between the largest firms and pretty much everybody else. Now, what this means, though, is also that the largest US manufacturers are much more exposed to global risk than their foreign competitors, right? Because they are much less reliant on a domestic supply base, which means they're far more exposed to changes in exchange rates, changes in trade policy. They're far more exposed to any disruption in some corner of the world than their foreign competitors. So, Rob's report talks a little bit about the sort of the fixation that we have with small businesses as the backbone of the economy, and that it's really large firms that we should also be looking at, which is true, because large firms are sort of canaries in the coal mine when you think about competitiveness. My own view is, these are two sides of the same coin, right? I mean, if you cannot have an economy where large firms are thriving and the small and mid-sized ones are not. Eventually, that's going to catch up with you. And likewise, you cannot have an economy where small and mid-sized firms get the support and large firms are left to die. You can't have that either. And so right now, we've really got a situation where the industrial base needs attention. This obviously has economic implications beyond just the manufacturing sector itself. And what you see here is the decline in income, labor income of the US economy. Right? People have talked about the fact that workers don't get as much of national income as they used to. And one question has always been, what role has the manufacturing sector's decline played in the fact that workers don't get as much? And it turns out it's actually quite a bit. It's about 68%. So 68% of the decline in the labor share of the US economy can be traced back to the decline of the manufacturing sector itself, which is a big deal if you think about the fact that the manufacturing sector only employs 9% of the workers, right? And so that pathway into the middle income, into productive middle income communities and jobs, the kinds of pathway that manufacturing provided, there really is no alternative. Or if there is one, no nation on this planet has actually found that pathway yet, which is why you see that both advanced economies and emerging economies are constantly focusing on manufacturing as a way to get that middle income and sustain that middle income pathway. We have neglected it, and we're paying the price for it. Let me also close with this bit. This is the trade deficit that Rob talked about. Right? Now, when we talk about trade deficit, we're not talking about making shoes and clothing here in the US. Right? We are talking about advanced industries. That's what this chart shows. R&D intensive, capital intensive industries, the kinds of industries where the US has massive endowments and where you would expect this country to have a huge competitive advantage, right? And what you find is that the orange line is sort of the aggregate trade deficit. And what you find is this has been getting worse over time. Even during the manufacturing resurgence of the last 5 years, you've seen the trade deficit is significantly worsened. We are the only nation, other than the United Kingdom, to have such a large and massive trade deficit in these sorts of industries. Right, we also looked at this, one of the debates that economists have is, should you look at gross trade or should you look at value-added trade? If you look at value-added trade, this actually looks a lot worse, surprising. So, it's only in the electronics industry that value-added trade looks better, but in all the other industries you find that value-added trade, the deficit looks worse for the US. And so this gets to the heart of the matter that Rob is talking about, right? The decline in competitiveness that you're seeing as a decline in the industrial base, the expansion of the trade deficit in advanced industries. So let me just close with a few of the things that we thought we as a nation need to focus on. And there are a couple of points that I want to call out. One is this notion of strengthening that domestic supply base. Another is number 6 at the bottom right, this idea of thinking and investing for the long term. It is great that we have a lot of local initiatives. There are many, many firms and local governments and agencies that are doing all kinds of things to try to revitalize manufacturing. Sometimes it's better to do something rather than nothing. But when a whole lot of some things add up to more or less nothing, then you have to start asking yourself, what is going on here? Right? And this gets to one of the first points that Rob made, which is this notion of coordination. If you don't have coordination, and if you don't have a long-term orientation for manufacturing, the sector doesn't respond to the initiatives that you throw at them, right? Because for any manufacturing firm, it takes 1 to 2 years to do a capital upgrade. It takes 5 to 6 years after that to start to see efficiency gains from those technology upgrades. So you're looking at a time horizon of somewhere between 5 to 7 years that a manufacturing firm needs support to be able to become more productive and become more competitive. And so in that environment, it's very difficult to have 6-month-long initiatives, 1-year-long initiatives, fragmented initiatives. It's very hard for those initiatives to actually gain traction and start moving the needle. So let me close with that. Thank you again, Rob, for that work. Again, I would highly encourage you folks to read this, and it's time we started having this discussion about a national competitive strategy.
Thank you.
It's been great listening to my fellow panelists here. I've learned a lot. And Rob, congratulations on a terrific report. Comprehensive. It should serve as a reference document because it lays out all the dimensions of the arguments and well argued and well referenced. So I appreciate that. It's a valuable addition to the literature. When I read through it, I made a bunch of comments, and I saw that they organized themselves into 3 what I think of as sidebars that I add to your document. One is on the forces arrayed against a national economic strategy, which you've covered some. I want to add a few more. The second is about the history, which you touched on, and I want to say a bit more about the history of this country in terms of economic competitiveness policy, which there was a thread that ran from 1790 to the 1930s, kind of disappeared. And then the third has to do with where we go now, and it's about the capabilities that I think are needed to implement the 6 dimensions of strategy and policy that Rob outlined. So to start with the forces arrayed against national economic strategy, the first, which Rob mentioned, is that particularly since the 30s, the geopolitical took precedence over the economic, which was really much, in terms of fighting fascism, fighting in the Cold War, which certainly was much easier in the 40s and 50s since we had no competition, right? The rest of our competitors destroyed themselves in the Second World War. So we got used to economic hegemony, where the U.S. was responsible for an incredibly large portion of the global manufacturing capacity for a very long time. One result is that there is an absence of institutional mechanisms to do competitiveness strategy. Compare the mechanisms we have for cyclical economic policy compared to the structural. We have, since the 40s, right, we have the Fed, the Council of Economic Advisors, is a huge attention to fiscal and monetary policy, interest rates, these are terrific institutions. They grew out of fears of repeating a Great Depression. They grew out of fears of inflation from the 70s. Very important, but it's about managing the business cycle almost hermetically sealed from the rest of the world, not about the structural stuff. One result of the focus on cyclical policy is that our economic data don't allow us to look at the structural stuff. They're set up to look at the cyclical stuff. The primary economic data products of the federal government are, the acronym is PFEIs, Principal Federal Economic Indicators. They're the pulse taking of the economy around inflation and the monthly economic employment report. So, right, there's this connect between the reports come up and Janet Yellen and the Fed, members of Congress will react to this around the cycle. We are missing certain kinds of data that are really important for competitiveness analysis. For one thing, and it sounds absurd, we don't have an official single set of statistics that tell us how many people are working by industry. We have several sets of competing and inconsistent data from the Census Bureau, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but because of certain laws, BLS and Census can't compare their data, right? And step one in competitiveness analysis is, okay, so how many people are working in various industries? Well, we don't have a single set of statistics. When BLS and Census did a comparison, without looking at the underlying records 10 years ago, they found that 1/3 of establishments were classified in 2 different industries, one by Census, one by BLS. It's hard to do good competitive analysis when you're dealing with that. We don't have enterprise statistics. Our statistics are by establishments. The Census Bureau used to do enterprise statistics. It killed the program, it brought it back, and it killed it again. Okay? So firm is not the unit of analysis for the most part, it's the establishment, which is limiting. We don't track, once upon a time our trade data were good enough because goods that came into this country typically were made in their entirety from another country, and vice versa. Our exports were entirely made in the US. That's not true anymore. There are global value chains. Our data do not let us see the trade in value added. TIVA is that acronym. So, right, each of our cell phones probably has 15 countries that added value to that phone. To do competitiveness strategy, you have to understand those global value chains. That's what McKinsey does. That's their business. We don't have, it's possible to do it. It's not been a priority. Last absence is, right, labor markets are really important, particularly because, right, that for anyone to get a stable job, you just find at a personal level, anyone to get a stable job that can support a family with or without a partner, you need some kind of post-secondary education. So everybody in the labor market has to make a decision about adding training and education after high school. And there are consequences if you make the wrong decision. So our labor markets need to work really well, and they're dysfunctional because people don't have the information they need to make good decisions. So employers, there's a mismatch between the skills and people are choosing to get and what employers are looking for. You can't be very competitive if you don't have well-functioning labor markets. Neither political party has a history at this point on competitiveness. The Democrats, the current set of Democrats, came out of the Keynesian and the redistribution modes of thinking, which is understandable. In 2010, in the American Competes Act, Senator Warner, I think at Rob's suggestion, added a requirement that the Department of Commerce do a competitiveness analysis of the US and come up with a competitiveness strategy. Rob, have you seen that document? Yeah. Well, you saw the first document. There was no second document. There was no strategy. So they punted. The Obama administration punted on the requirement to do the competitiveness analysis that they did was garbage, and it was touting the activities of the administration. It was not a serious analysis, and there was no strategy. The NNMI is a terrific, it's a great program. It's not a strategy, it's a program. The Republicans, once upon a time, the Republican Party was tied to big business that was in the traded sector. We're talking the 19th century, when U.S. Steel, all these companies identified as American, they were traded, and the Republican Party did the work of the big traded businesses. But from the mid-20th century forward, those big businesses, their interests have diverged from American interests. And the Republican Party has become the party of what were once the Southern Democrats and business people who are affected by federal regulation, extraction, right, the non-traded stuff, journalism, Sheldon Adelson, the multinationals are not players the way they used to be because their interests are different. So, and the Republican Party in the last 30 years, its focus has been to delegitimize the role of the federal government. So, because of where these people are coming from, right? If you want to extract natural resources, you want to get the federal government out of the way. And then, of course, there's the whole history of Jim Crow, and that kind of local control that there was a history of government being an intruder. Assertions of American exceptionalism, right? We hear how America is an exceptional nation. And there's a sense that if you have to compete, you're not exceptional. I mean, if we're exceptional, then why do we even have to think about this stuff? We will just win. Okay. There is an absence of a recognized field of national economic development. Rob called us economists, but we're not, economists would not think of us as economists. All four of us come from very eclectic backgrounds, because those are the kinds of backgrounds you need to do economic strategy. But there's no field for it. We're all self-trained. So that gets to the sociology of the economics profession, which is essentially a guild in which macroeconomics is really applied engineering, in which the idea is to create the formulas that allow you to figure out what's going on and how to affect it. But it doesn't lend itself to strategic analysis. And as in any profession, there's a certain hegemony. The economics profession does not want competition. It wants to be a monopoly in the field of economic policy. It lends itself to homogeneity and really exact details. Economic strategy requires heterogeneity, looking at messy details and getting information that is good enough. You don't get tenure if that's how you write economics papers. So there is Rob quoted economists from across the political spectrum, but there's a consistent pushback against. All right, so last couple things is one, in terms of history, tariffs. Congress set tariffs from 1790 to the early 1930s. It was a very jealously guarded prerogative. Tariffs were seen, whether they were effective or not is a separate question, but they were seen as the tool of competitiveness. From the very get-go, from Hamilton, the Congress in the first 30 years of the country's existence asked for 4 manufacturing strategies from the Department of Treasury, in which Treasury, so here are the ones were competitive. The people at they would recognize what McKinsey does, because they say, here's where we're competitive, so we can keep tariffs low. Here's where we're not competitive, we can raise them. So there were a set of institutions, including the whole statistical system, were built on trying to help Congress set tariffs at a level that facilitated competitiveness. But of course, that's all gone. The last thing, in terms of capabilities, I suggest to think about a couple boxes. Monitoring, having a data system that allows us to see what's going on and assess it. Secondly, public-private collaboration around analysis and recommended action by industry. One of the things that I have here, this is the 1925 report of the Bureau of Foreign and Domestic Commerce in the Commerce Department. The Automotive Division. To obtain direct information on foreign competition, the chief of the Automotive Division visited 9 European countries, inspecting plants, attending exhibitions, and interviewing officials, manufacturers, and dealers. Every division in Herbert Hoover's Commerce Department had a private advisory committee, and they worked hand in glove. Now, they were all white males, and they were all from the same class, but that's the model. This was around programs, not policy, but still. So I think there is, given that the economic strategies have to be industry specific, that you need this kind of collaboration within an industry. And I'd love to see ITIF just get the ball going and demonstrate how that might be possible by convening people from the public and the private sector in one industry. Last 2 things, evaluation. There's a Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking that just came out with a very good report. Congress is implementing enhancing the ability of the federal government to analyze the impacts of federal programs, and that will be to the benefit of strategy. And the last thing is to have the government provide the information needed so that labor markets can work better. And this is all possible so that we can see supply of and demand for labor by occupation, so that 18-year-olds have a sense of what their options are, both in terms of careers, but also in terms of institutions. If I go to this engineering school compared to that engineering school, what are the odds I'm going to get what I'm looking for? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andy. So, just make A couple of quick remarks, and then I want to open it up, and then if Senator Coons joins us, we'll have to switch over. First of all, Mark, 100% agree with you. Regions critical. Needs to be a partnership, though. We can't rely only on regions or only on the federal government. Secondly, Sri, I think you were alluding to a new book we have coming out, Big and Beautiful, MIT Press, which we argue that large corporations play a pretty important role in the U.S. economy and it's underrepresented. One of the key points we make in that book, though, is that the small sector is critically important in supply chains. Fundamentally don't care about small pizza parlors. I just don't. I do care about small and supply chains. So it is that linkage, so I 100% agree with that. And then, Andrew, to your point, I couldn't agree more. I mean, one just, glaring to me oversight, one of the most important things that we should know about the U.S. economy is how much existing establishments last year invested in new machinery, equipment, and software. Not in building a new factory, but in an existing thing. How much did they upgrade? We do not know that. This is kind of the most important thing we should have. Are our companies buying new machinery, software, and equipment? Are they training their workers on it, or are they harvesting old machinery? We have no way of knowing that because our national statistical system doesn't even bother to collect that data. So lots and lots of challenges. And when we hear from Senator Coons, well, there are some positive things on the table here. Things have happened, things that will happen. So let's open it up. If you have a question, just raise your hand and wait for the mic because we're recording this right here. Chuck, if you could also identify who you are, please.
And thanks for a really superb session, Rome. This is excellent. I just wanted to touch on a point that Mark raised. Consistency in the federal government is over administrations is something of a challenge, as 1600 seems to be demonstrating to us daily. But the regions that you mentioned have a longer-term focus, and there are examples. I'm currently studying on the New York Nano Cluster, which has been massively successful, and there are others. So I just would like your view, but I think that for consistency, for longer-term investments, and reflecting the federal nature of the country, that state initiatives need to be emphasized looking forward. I think it may save us in part in the end, but I'd be interested in your views.
I'll just briefly say, I almost added that point. Regions shouldn't be thought of as just the delivery point of the federal policy. I think you're saying they're a stabilizing effect. And in fact, and Rob, who's been a state economic development official, right? But, I see a lot of superior practice in the most sophisticated regions in the country. And I think we could all tick off a number of these. So I think that there's also a way to get differentiation and variation into products and innovation systems as well. But I think that we could go across the map and now find a quite impressive roster of, region-based, fact-driven organizations commissioning their own research. They can't handle the full suite of agendas that Rob has mentioned, but they are doing a very significant set of industrial strategies and regions. I agree with you, Joe.
Other questions? Yes, sir, right up here in the second row.
My name is James Fabumi. I'm with the American Heritage Defense Corporation. We're a think tank. And our focus is on pointing out opportunities for the United States to significantly improve its competitiveness via diversity and inclusion. And I was enjoying the presentation by Andrew Rimmer because right from the get-go, it was hitting all the right points. The fact that we went through the Jim Crow era, the fact that most of our competitors were decimated by the war. And the best way to look at it is that because we didn't really have too much competition, we were like a champion boxer that could beat all his enemies with one hand, tied behind his back. Okay, because we were so strong and we could deliver whatever anybody wanted. But now things are changing, and all these other economies are coming back and competing with us. And I just see that there's a low-hanging fruit for really significantly advancing the competitiveness of the country by opening up access to more of its citizens to participate in the traded economies. Because most of the minorities and the underrepresented people in the country, they're mostly local. They survive by what goes on inside the country. They're not engaged in reaching out to new markets. We have a huge emerging market in Africa. We don't have African American enterprises penetrating those markets on our behalf. So I just wanted to point that out, that if it ever gets to a point where these policies are being implemented, that diversity and inclusiveness should be one of the principal things to be looked at.
Yeah, there's a new report that just came, a new study that just came out, I believe, last Thursday by one of the co-authors with John Van Reenen at London School of Economics. They looked at the United States, they looked at patent holders, and they then looked at who the patent holders were and where they came from. And one of the most interesting things they found was that if you were from a socioeconomically disadvantaged group or lived in a socioeconomically disadvantaged area, including disadvantaged minorities, and you had the same math scores as advantaged people who got a patent, your likelihood of getting a patent was dramatically smaller. So it was an argument not that somehow that there isn't a pool of really highly talented people who just simply don't get the opportunities that if they had gotten, there would be this more inputs, if you will, to the innovation system. So I think that's right. I guess I would just caution, it seems like our politics has been so focused almost in a hyper way on, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but on diversity questions. And I don't deny that diversity questions are not important, but I worry that our politics is excluding these other kinds of factors and only focusing on diversity. For example, when you think about things like education, we could have a set of policies, as alluded to in this John Van Reenen report, where we do a much better job of enabling kids who are really highly talented from disadvantaged backgrounds. We could do that. But sort of our politics it doesn't really want to do that because you're being elitist by only picking the kids who are really, really smart. So I think we have to, I think your point is that, and the other point I think is a good one, is a lot of minority entrepreneurs, Vietnamese entrepreneurs in our country who could have better ties in terms of exports with Vietnam, African entrepreneurs who come from Africa, the same thing with that, and build these linkages. So I think that's an important point. Sri, did you want to do that?
I appreciate your point, to add that, right, there's a nativist strain in politics that we haven't seen for quite a while, which is anti-immigration. And I think that, Rob, that particular approach to shutting down immigration in the way it's being done, it hurts competitiveness.
I think the one thing I would add, so I'm going to stay away from the political stuff. But the point that you made about the growth that's happening overseas and the fact that there's relatively few American firms export, and most of the ones that do apparently export to Canada, and then you would argue that's not really an export. But you're right, there's a lot of export opportunity. What we've seen is that even in cases where large American firms sell overseas, they often don't participate in direct exports. They open up foreign affiliates. And the foreign affiliates tend to source from local providers, which means that the domestic American industrial base doesn't get to benefit from that export participation as much as, if you're a Korean firm or a German domestic supplier, you tend to have a lot more export exposure either yourself or through the supply chain of a German multinational. And so those are opportunities that we have seen. There's significant room for growth there.
Great. Right here, and then we'll go here. Dana.
Thank you. It's Dana Marshall, Transnational Strategy Group. Thank you very much to all the panelists. I guess, Rob, your presentation was great. You rounded up a lot of the issues, but it kind of begged one of the questions that I had, and that is, when you were speaking about the establishment, the convention, whether it's the economic establishment and the national security establishment, I guess the question is, what do we do about changing the establishment's view? To what extent, in your mind and in the mind of the panelists, is it a matter of ideology? Is it prior education? Is it campaign contributions? What is it that is stalling us moving ahead? Because without that, these are the people who are going to be advising candidates who will be in future government. Without those changes, we will continue to have these nice conversations without progress.
So I think it was Thomas Kuhn who once said that science progresses one funeral at a time. So we can wait for that. Unfortunately, the class reproduces itself. I see Senator Kuhn here, so I want to segue into that. But Dana, really, really critical question. And I think fundamentally that will come from our top leaders making choices. Now, what's interesting is you look at the trade debate in Washington and how the trade establishment is now talking about trade. They're talking about it in a very different way than they talked about it 12 months ago because of President Trump. And you can argue whether you like some of his policies or not, but clearly I think Trump is more of a rationalist or defending our interests when it comes to trade. And when that signal comes from the top that, hey, we're going to get tough on China, you do see the sort of trade elite and the intellectual class start to change how they talk about it and how they think about it. And so I do think ultimately it has to start there. I'm going to take a moment here to introduce Senator Coons, who we are greatly honored. I know, I'm going to do it super fast. Senator from Delaware. There we go. I'm not going to do it that fast. A great senator from Delaware.
There we go.
Lots of experience in Newcastle County as an elected official, as an administrator. Also has a degree in divinity and engineering. So, well, chemical engineering.
Engineers would be offended. But
I thought
chemists would be proud.
Worked at W.L. Gore, Vortex, so really understands these questions, and really has been a leader in the Senate in thinking about and advocating a set of policies around competitiveness. RD tax credit, really involved in this great program, the Manufacturing Universities program, a leader in the Trade Secrets Act, working on many, many other areas to move our country forward. And relative to this, most importantly, he is co-chair and co-founder of the Senate Competitiveness Caucus with Senator Jerry Moran. So, thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you to ITIF for hosting today. And we've known each other, oh gosh, over 20 years now. And I'm grateful, Rob, for your tireless advocacy for competitiveness, for innovation, for entrepreneurship, for policies that help ensure that we remain the strongest, most technologically advanced nation on earth through good public policy. And to the panelists who provided, I know, a rich menu of insights into all the different components and drivers of competitiveness. As Rob just mentioned in his gracious introduction, these are some of the many reasons why I co-sponsored, co-founded, co-lead with my good friend Jerry Moran of Kansas, Republican senator, the Senate Competitiveness Caucus. And it's not just a caucus on paper, as many are. It's a caucus that actually hosts events that tries to pull together thought leaders in a wide range of the fields that make up competitiveness, whether it's intellectual property or immigration, whether it's tax or trade. And so this bipartisan competitiveness caucus now includes a dozen senators working together to highlight how the federal government can help foster a competitive U.S. economy in many ways. And as I'm sure you've heard from this great panel, the competitive spirit, which is the foundation of our capitalist economy, is one of the key factors that propelled our nation forward over the last 2 centuries. But competitiveness, as it was understood in the 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries, were about naval dominance, mercantilism, in a very differently configured world. Today, after globalization has not just emerged, but is now the dominant global economic challenge and opportunity, we have to continue to focus on innovation and on what are the drivers of innovation and how can public policy help support a strong workforce, help support strong intellectual property rules, help produce boosts in productivity, help sustain innovation, which in combination, I think, make for competitiveness. You've got a wonderful report that I'm excited to have an opportunity to read that talks about how we are facing a chronic trade deficit that's been steadily building since 2000, that we've accumulated, I thought this was a wrong number, but an $8.5 trillion negative trade balance in both goods and services, and how we can learn a great deal from our global competitors, whether Japan or Germany. I worked for a global manufacturing company, as Rob mentioned in the introduction, that had significant operations really only in the United States, Germany, and Japan. And folks in the United States will often criticize the cost of labor, the cost of healthcare, the cost of a variety of different investments in workforce, and yet our competitors in Germany and Japan have made more significant investments in wages and in R&D and remained ahead of us. There's reasons for that, and there's reasons that we could, I think, learn from their leadership and their lesson. And one of those reasons, one of those examples, I think, is the Manufacturing USA strategy, which is an intentional mimicking of what some of our most successful competitors have done. China has shifted its focus away from investments in basic scientific research towards more applied research and commercialization. This also, I think, is going to make a greater challenge for us in our competitive environment. They're advancing clean energy with investments that are just staggering. I think $360 billion in 2020. He's getting closer because if I don't leave in 2 minutes, I miss an absolutely essential meeting I have to be at. So I'm simply going to say, in closing, rather than delivering another 3 pages of exciting remarks, that the chance to work across the aisle with senators like Senator Roberts on the bill that expanded the R&D tax credit, with Senator Moran on the Competitiveness Caucus, with Senator Hatch on the Defend Trade Secrets Act, is some of the best and most rewarding work I've had the honor of doing as a senator. If you continue to push us as senators to find our way towards each other, to be bipartisan, and to be thorough and thoughtful and capable in how we do things like tax and trade and immigration and workforce policy, we can remain a highly competitive country. If we don't, we will fail. And we need your input, your support, your advice, and your policy leadership. Forgive the brevity of my remarks, but I must be at another meeting in 3 minutes. Thank you. Thanks for